reception hall went silent for exactly 3 seconds before the laughter started. Elena Marlowe stood frozen beside the dessert table, her phone buzzing against her palm for the 4th time in under a minute. She didn't need to look. She already knew what was on the screen, because the woman in the ivory dress 2 tables over was reading it aloud to a cluster of guests who weren't even trying to lower their voices. "Look at this comment," the woman said, holding up her phone like a trophy. "She looks like she ate the real bride." Oh my God, someone actually wrote that. Elena's wedding photos had been posted online less than 6 hours ago. Her own cousin had uploaded them, tagged half of Manhattan's social scene, and within an hour, the images had migrated somewhere far uglier than a family album. Now strangers were dissecting her body in the comments section of a stranger's repost, and the people laughing loudest were standing 15 feet from where she was trying to breathe. She set down the champagne flute she'd been holding since the ceremony ended. Her hand wasn't shaking. She'd promised herself it wouldn't shake. "Elena." The voice came from behind her, low and even, the kind of voice that didn't need volume to command a room. She turned and found her husband of 6 hours, watching her with an expression she hadn't yet learned to read. Damiano Rossi stood a head taller than most of the men in that ballroom, his dark suit cut close enough to remind everyone exactly what kind of power lived beneath it. He hadn't smiled once during the ceremony. He wasn't smiling now. "Everything's fine," Elena said, because that was the lie she'd been telling herself all evening. His eyes moved past her shoulder, toward the table, where the laughter still hadn't stopped, toward the woman, still scrolling through comments about his wife's body, like it was entertainment. Something shifted behind his gaze, something Elena couldn't name yet, but would come to recognize as the exact moment before Damiano Rossi decided a person no longer mattered to him. "Give me your phone," he said. "Damiano, your phone, Elena." She handed it over. He didn't look at the photos. He didn't need to. He simply turned, walked toward the small stage where the band had just finished a song, and took the microphone out of the lead singer's hand without asking. The room quieted instantly. 300 guests, half of them Rossi family associates, who understood exactly what that silence meant. Half of them, Elena's own relatives, who had no idea what they were about to witness. "I want to thank everyone for coming tonight," Damiano said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall without effort. "Some of you have known me 20 years. Some of you barely know me at all, but every single one of you is about to learn something important, so I suggest you listen carefully." Elena's stomach dropped. She recognized that tone. She'd heard it exactly once before, 3 weeks ago, in a boardroom where a man twice her age had gone pale and left without finishing his coffee. "My wife's photographs are circulating online right now, and apparently some of you find them amusing enough to discuss at her own wedding." His gaze swept the room, landing without hurry on the woman in ivory, who had gone very still. "I've had people investigated for less. I've ended business relationships for less. So understand this. The next comment I hear about my wife's body, her weight, or her appearance, will be the last thing that person says to me directly, because after that, we won't be speaking anymore. We'll be having a very different kind of conversation." Nobody breathed. Somewhere near the bar, a glass clinked against a table and sounded like a gunshot. "Elena Rossi is the most capable person in this room," he continued, and something in his voice changed, dropped lower, became something closer to a warning, wrapped around a fact. "She built her career, finding the things powerful men try to hide. She is not a joke. She is not an accessory. She is my wife, and if that word means nothing to some of you, I'd encourage you to ask around about what it's meant to the people who forgot it before." He set the microphone down. The silence held for a long moment before the band, apparently understanding their job better than anyone else in the room, started playing again. Elena stood rooted in place as he crossed back to her, his expression unreadable once more, as though he hadn't just detonated a small bomb over 300 people's heads. "You didn't have to do that," she said quietly. "Yes, I did. Everyone's going to talk about this for weeks." "Good," he said. "Let them talk about that instead." She studied him, this man she'd married that morning in a contract neither of them had wanted 6 months ago. A man whose family controlled half the ports on the eastern seaboard, and whose name made grown men reconsider their next sentence. She'd expected indifference from him. She'd expected, at best, tolerance. She had not expected this. "Why do you care?" she asked, because the question had been sitting in her chest since the ceremony, since the moment he'd slid the ring onto her finger, without meeting her eyes. "We both know why we're here, Damiano. This isn't real." Something flickered across his face, there and gone before she could name it. "It's real enough that no one gets to humiliate you and call it a joke," he said. "Whatever else this is, that part isn't negotiable." Before she could respond, a man appeared at Damiano's shoulder, someone Elena recognized vaguely from the ceremony, one of the quiet men who never smiled and never sat far from the exits. He leaned in and murmured something too low for her to catch, but she watched Damiano's jaw tighten, watched the muscle there flex once, sharp and controlled. "What is it?" she asked. Damiano didn't answer right away. He handed her back the phone, his fingers brushing hers for half a second longer than necessary, and when he finally spoke, his voice had dropped into something colder than she'd heard from him all night. "Nothing that concerns you tonight," he said, which was, Elena would later understand, the first lie he ever told her. But she saw the way his eyes flicked toward the woman in ivory, one more time, before he turned away, saw the recognition pass between them like a current, brief and unmistakable, and she understood, with sudden, bone-deep certainty, that whatever had just happened in that message was not nothing at all. It was the beginning of something neither of them was ready for. The morning after the wedding, Elena woke in a bedroom that wasn't hers, in a penthouse that smelled like cedar and money, sunlight cutting hard lines across sheets she hadn't chosen. She lay still, cataloging the strangeness of it, the way her own body already felt like a guest in someone else's life. She found Damiano in the kitchen, dressed as though the wedding had never happened, a laptop open beside a coffee he hadn't touched. Neither of them said anything at first, two strangers negotiating the rules of a marriage that existed on paper before it existed anywhere else. He told her, without much preamble, that a team was coming at 9 to review the Whitmore merger documents, and that she should be there. "I thought the point of marrying me was that my name goes on paper, and I disappear into your world quietly," she said. "That's not what I said," he answered, and something in his tone made her look up from her coffee. Elena had spent 6 months assuming she'd been chosen for this marriage because of her silence, her willingness to disappear into a name and a role that asked nothing of her mind. She said as much, half testing him, half genuinely curious whether he'd bother correcting her. He did. The Whitmore Audit Division was folding into the family's shipping business, he explained, and its books needed someone who could actually read them instead of signing off on whatever the accountants handed over. She was a forensic accountant. That wasn't a coincidence. It was, he said plainly, exactly why his father had suggested this arrangement in the first place. "So I'm not just a wife," she said. "I'm an asset." "You're both," Damiano said. No apology in it, only fact. She hadn't expected that answer to feel like the first honest thing anyone had told her in 6 months. But it did, and she said nothing further, only nodded and went to get dressed before the accountants arrived. At 9 sharp, 3 men in expensive suits arrived with banker's boxes that Damiano's assistant, a sharp-eyed woman named Priya, arranged across the dining table like a battlefield map. Elena pulled the first folder toward her, and within 20 minutes had circled 4 line items, that didn't reconcile. A shipping manifest claiming 40 containers out of Newark against an insurance claim accounting for only 32. She laid it out for the lead accountant, a balding man named Fensley, who carried the particular arrogance of someone used to being the smartest man in any room. "This isn't a rounding error," she told him, when he tried to wave the discrepancy off as a logistics quirk. "Someone's skimming inventory and covering it with insurance fraud, and if I found it in 20 minutes, the SEC will find it in a week." Damiano, standing near the window, turned slowly, and Elena watched something recalibrate behind his eyes. Not about her body this time, about her mind, and the calm, surgical way she'd just dismantled a man twice her age without raising her pulse. He ordered the full manifest history pulled for 6 months, and Fensley's assistant brought in immediately, and the accountants were dismissed, with instructions to return with better answers. Later, Damiano found her on the terrace, watching the East River churn gray beneath a colorless sky. He told her, almost reluctantly, that nobody had spoken to Fensley like that in 15 years, including him. It wasn't quite a compliment, but it wasn't far from one either, and something in the admission made Elena decide the terrace was where she'd tell him about the message she'd been carrying since the reception, the one his associate had murmured to him before he'd gone cold and evasive. His expression closed the moment she raised it. "It's handled," he said, and when she pressed that this wasn't an answer, he told her there were parts of his world she didn't need access to yet, that trust had to be earned on both sides. "Then earn mine," she said, "by telling me why Victoria Hale looked at you like she still owns something you haven't given her." The name landed between them like a dropped glass. Damiano went very still before he finally told her the shape of it, that he and Victoria had been engaged 2 years before his father decided the Marlowe alliance served the family better, that she hadn't taken the change well, and that the message the night before had come from a contact inside her father's organization, reporting that Victoria had been meeting 3 times that month with the Castellano family, the Rossi's oldest rivals. "You think she's working with them," Elena said, the floor of the conversation shifting beneath her. "I think the woman standing 15 feet from my wedding, laughing at your photographs, may be planning something considerably more dangerous than an insult," he said. "Until I know exactly what, be careful who you talk to in this house." She wrapped her arms around herself against a wind that had nothing to do with the temperature. 24 hours into a marriage of convenience, and already the ground beneath her was cracking open to reveal something far more treacherous than she'd bargained for. Every answer he gave her seemed to open 2 more questions behind it. "Careful of who?" she asked. "Exactly." Damiano didn't answer. He was already looking past her, toward Priya, who stood in the doorway with a face gone pale, holding a phone out toward him, with the particular stillness of someone about to deliver very bad news. Priya's hand trembled as she held out the phone. There had been a fire at the Newark terminal, Warehouse 14, the one holding the Whitmore inventory records, and the fire department was already saying it had started in the records room specifically. Damiano listened for 30 seconds, and his expression didn't change, which Elena was beginning to understand was more frightening than if it had. "Get the car," he said. "I'm coming," Elena said, already moving toward the door. When he told her this wasn't her problem to walk into, she cut him off. "Those are the exact documents I flagged this morning. Someone burned evidence 3 hours after I found it. Whoever goes into that warehouse needs to read damaged ledgers, and that rules out everyone but me." The warehouse still smelled of scorched paper and wet ash when they arrived. Firefighters coiled hoses near the entrance while a fire marshal explained to Damiano that the room where the ledgers were kept was the only part that had burned completely, that everything else stood untouched, that this was not an electrical fire, but arson, and that someone had known exactly what they wanted destroyed. Elena stepped past both men before anyone could stop her, pulling a flashlight from her bag, the same one she'd carried for site audits, untouched for 6 months while she'd planned a wedding instead of working a case. She found a fireproof filing cabinet that had partially survived. Its drawers warped, but not destroyed. Whoever had set the fire, either unaware it existed or out of time before they could reach it. Inside were duplicate shipping manifests, singed but legible, the kind companies kept for insurance purposes. She spread 3 pages across a nearby table and found what she was looking for within minutes. A line dated March 14th, showing 8 containers, manifested as machine parts, routed to a private dock in Bayonne instead of the main terminal. Someone had been running a parallel shipping operation using Whitmore's paperwork as cover, and had just tried to burn the only proof of it. Damiano leaned over her shoulder to look, close enough that she caught the low scent of cedar and rain on his coat. "That dock belongs to a shell company," he said. "I need to know who owns it." "I can find that," Elena said. "It's public record if you know where to dig. I traced this exact kind of thing for 3 years before I ever heard your family's name." "Do it tonight, if you can," he said, respect layered now beneath the command, in a way that hadn't existed 24 hours earlier. They worked at the dining table past midnight. Elena's laptop open beside corporate records, Priya pulled from state databases. It was, Elena realized, somewhere near 1 in the morning. The first time since the wedding, the silence between them had felt comfortable instead of strained. "Got it," she said finally, turning her screen toward him. "Coastal Diversified Holdings. Registered 18 months ago, filed by a law firm that also handles paperwork for the Hale family." Damiano went very still. "It could be old business," he said, something from before the engagement ended, though his voice carried the flatness of a man convincing himself of something he didn't fully believe. She pointed out that 18 months ago was right around when his father had started negotiating her family's alliance instead of Victoria's, and the silence that followed stretched long enough that she wondered if she'd overstepped, wondered if she'd just accused the wrong person out loud in a house full of walls that might be listening. He told her, quietly, that he and Victoria had grown up together, that their fathers had been partners 20 years before they weren't, that when his mother died, Victoria had been the only person who hadn't told him it would get easier, who had simply sat with him for weeks. He didn't want to believe she'd do this. When Elena asked what had happened to his mother, his expression closed so fast she almost flinched, and he told her that wasn't tonight's conversation. She didn't push. He asked her to keep working it quietly, to find him something his father couldn't dismiss as jealousy, since Salvatore had known the Hales longer than her own family. She promised him undeniable proof within 2 days. What he didn't tell her that night was that he'd already asked a contact to quietly pull her old case files, the ones from before their marriage was ever discussed. Curious what kind of woman built a career, finding what powerful men tried hardest to bury. Some part of him no longer trusted coincidence, not even the coincidence of a wife, this capable landing in his house. "You're not what I expected," he said instead. "Neither are you," Elena admitted, and neither of them moved to close the distance between them, the moment stretching long enough to become its own kind of confession. It was Priya's return, breathless, that broke it. The footage was already live on 3 accounts, grainy but unmistakable, time-stamped an hour earlier, showing the fire, Damiano's men working the scene, and Elena crouched by the fireproof cabinet, flashlight in hand, clearly visible. The caption beneath it, in bold red letters, called her a bride, caught at a suspicious warehouse fire, and asked what she was hiding. "Someone filmed us," Elena said, cold spreading through her chest. "Someone knew we'd be there. Damiano's face had gone to stone. Or someone made sure we would be." The video spread faster than anyone could contain it. By morning, Elena's name was trending alongside words like suspicious and staged, and the wedding photographs had resurfaced with a new caption, one that painted her not as an object of ridicule anymore, but something closer to a suspect. Staring at her phone across the breakfast table, coffee going cold beside her, Elena pointed out that some of the accounts were naming Coastal Diversified directly. How would strangers online know that name unless someone leaked it? She asked. Someone who was in that warehouse, Damiano said, his voice flat. Or close enough to know what we found. Or someone who's been listening to us since the wedding. He didn't say who he suspected, and the silence that followed carried more weight than any accusation would have. That afternoon, Damiano's lead logistics attorney arrived to review the merger contracts. A smooth-talking man named Reyes, who spent 20 minutes leaning too close to Elena's chair, complimenting her instincts with the particular warmth of a man who noticed a wedding ring and decided it didn't apply to his manners. Elena handled it the way she handled everything, with a level stare and a redirect back to the documents. Damiano said nothing at the time, but when Reyes left, his hand found the small of her back, brief and possessive, a gesture that hadn't existed a week earlier. "You didn't like that," Elena said. "I didn't like watching a man decide you were available for flattery in my own house," Damiano said, an edge in his voice she hadn't heard, directed at anyone but Fensley. "It won't happen twice. You could have just said something instead of glowering at him across the table." "I don't glower." "You absolutely glower," Elena said, and for the first time in days, something almost like a smile pulled at the corner of his mouth, quickly suppressed, as though he hadn't given himself permission to enjoy anything since the fire. It was on the fourth night that Elena found him in the study, long after midnight, a framed photograph in his hands. He hadn't heard her enter to see. She recognized the woman in it immediately, dark-haired and elegant, Damiano's same sharp jaw softened by a smile that belonged to someone who hadn't yet learned what the world could take from her. "Your mother," Elena said softly. He told her the whole of it, before she'd even asked. He'd been 12. His father's business partner at the time, a man he'd called uncle, had been skimming from the family for years, and when his father confronted him, the man had panicked, coming to the house that night, convinced he was about to be killed. His mother had answered the door. He'd watched from the hallway, as the man shot her twice before his father's men reached him. His father had told him afterward that trust was a door left open for people to walk through and hurt you, and that the only way to survive was to keep it locked, permanently, for everyone. He'd kept it locked ever since, until Elena started finding things in his company nobody else could see. Elena didn't move, understanding the story needed silence more than sympathy. She told him she wouldn't repeat it, and meant it with a certainty that surprised her, a loyalty forming faster than she'd intended to allow, faster than seemed wise for a marriage built on a contract instead of choice. His hand rose, brushing a strand of hair from her face, and she felt her breath catch at the unfamiliar gentleness of it. Then, his phone rang. He answered without stepping away from her, and she watched his expression shift, the tenderness closing like a fist. Fensley had disappeared, his office cleared out that morning. Whatever he'd been hiding, apparently worth more to him than his job. "That's not a coincidence," Elena said. "He was handling the Whitmore books. If he's gone, whoever's behind Coastal Diversified panicked." "Or you scared him into it," Damiano said, an edge in his voice she hadn't heard directed at her before. "You went at him hard in that meeting. Maybe he saw the writing on the wall." The accusation landed like cold water. She asked if he was saying this was her fault, and he retreated instead into the armor she recognized now as his oldest habit, telling her she didn't know these people the way he did, that this wasn't an audit, that people didn't just lose their jobs when they were caught. She reminded him that 4 days of being shut out of every meeting that actually mattered hadn't stopped him from blaming her for the one thing he'd asked her to do in the first place. He stopped at the door on his way out, told her they'd finish this later, and left without answering when she asked whether he'd lock this door too, the way he locked everything else. The sound of it closing behind him felt louder than it should have, echoing through a penthouse that suddenly felt enormous and empty. She didn't cry. She'd promised herself, the night of the wedding, that she wouldn't give anyone the satisfaction of watching her fall apart. Instead, she set the photograph down carefully and went back to her laptop, to numbers that made sense, even when the man who'd married her didn't. It was past 3 in the morning when her phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number, no name attached. 7 words that made her blood run cold, words that felt less like a threat than a promise. "You're asking questions that get people killed." Elena stared at the message until the screen dimmed, then lit it again, reading the words a second time, as though they might rearrange into something less threatening. They didn't. She thought about waking Damiano, but the memory of the study door closing behind him stopped her. He'd made it clear this wasn't her world to navigate. So instead, she did what she'd always done when frightened. She worked, screenshotting the message, saving the number, going back to the coastal diversified filings with hands that only shook a little. At 6 in the morning, Damiano's phone rang with news that changed the shape of everything. Fensley had been found in his car at a rest stop off the turnpike, dead, made to look like a heart attack. The coroner his family trusted said otherwise. Someone had wanted a message sent, not just a problem solved, and the message had landed on both their phones within the hour. By 7, Damiano's father had called an emergency meeting of the family's senior associates, and Elena was seated at the table before she understood why. Salvatore Rossi, silver-haired and formidable in a way that made his son look almost young by comparison, laid a printed article between them, the one naming Coastal Diversified, the one implying Elena had orchestrated the fire. He accused her outright, listing the incidents like evidence in a trial she hadn't been told she was standing. A dead accountant this morning, a leaked video days before that. Discrepancies she claims to have found conveniently timed, with a fire that destroyed the only proof of them, he said. "I want to know why I shouldn't assume she's the source of this family's exposure, instead of its protector." "Because I found the fraud before the fire happened," Elena said, refusing to let her voice shake. "If I'd said it, I wouldn't have needed to. I'd have just let the discrepancy disappear quietly." One of the older captains near the window suggested that was exactly what a guilty woman would say. Convenient timing, dressed up as innocence. She held his gaze without flinching, and told him she'd spent her entire career finding exactly this kind of convenient timing in other people's fraud, that she knew what it looked like when someone staged a discovery, and that this wasn't it. A murmur moved around the table. Not agreement exactly, but the particular silence of men recalculating an assumption. Damiano's jaw had gone rigid, caught between his father's authority and the woman beside him, and Elena watched him choose, in real time, the harder path. She wasn't the leak, he told the room, but until they knew who was, she'd stay out of family business meetings, effective immediately. The words landed like a slap, worse for how quietly he'd said them, worse for how reasonable they sounded to everyone else at the table. Elena stood, gathering the folder she hadn't been allowed to open, and left the room without giving any of them the satisfaction of watching her face. She found him an hour later on the terrace. "You could have defended me in there, instead of just deciding I was a liability to manage. I kept you in this house," he said. "I kept you safe from a room that would have voted to send you back to your family within the hour, if I hadn't offered them something. Being excluded from meetings is not the same as being disowned. It felt the same from where I was sitting." Something in his voice cracked slightly when he admitted he wasn't good at this, at protecting someone without also controlling them, that he'd never had to separate the two before. She wasn't ready yet to forgive him for it. His father had looked at her like she was a liability to be contained, and he hadn't corrected him. He told her, more quietly than before, that correcting Salvatore in that room would have cost him more authority than he could afford to spend on her right now, that he wasn't choosing his father over her, only trying to keep both of them standing long enough to actually fix this. She asked him to let her help fix it from wherever he'd let her stand. and something shifted behind his eyes. The particular recalibration she'd come to recognize as respect, fighting past his instinct to control the outcome. Find something before morning, he told her, and he'd put her back in that room himself. She went back to her laptop, refusing to let the exclusion become the end of her usefulness. It was well past midnight when she found it, buried in a financial filing Priya had pulled weeks earlier and never flagged as relevant. A corporate card, registered to the law firm handling Coastal Diversified's paperwork, had charged an industrial supply purchase in Newark the morning of the fire, 6 hours before Elena had ever set foot in the warehouse. She printed the receipt and walked it straight to the conference room, setting it on the table without a word. Salvatore read it twice, admitting slowly that this proved someone else had purchased ignition materials before the fire, well before his daughter-in-law had ever touched those files. "I told you," Elena said. "I find fraud. I don't create it." The room's temperature shifted, suspicion curdling into something closer to respect, and Damiano, watching from the doorway, looked at his wife, the way a man looks at someone he'd underestimated the size of. Before anyone could speak further, Priya appeared, breathless. Victoria Hale was downstairs, asking to see Damiano alone, warning that if he didn't agree tonight, she wouldn't get another chance. Victoria Hale sat in the penthouse's sitting room like a woman who'd rehearsed her own arrival, spine straight, hands folded, every inch the poised heiress Elena had watched laugh at wedding photographs less than 2 weeks ago. Up close, Elena noticed what the ballroom lighting had hidden. Dark circles beneath careful makeup, a tremor in her folded hands she couldn't quite still. She'd asked to see Damiano alone, and when Elena stayed at his insistence, something flickered across Victoria's face. Surprise, maybe even respect. She admitted, her voice wavering before she steadied it, that Damiano already knew about her father's debt, that he'd always been terrible at hiding things from her, and that he understood why she'd been going to Castellano's building. What he didn't understand yet was what Castellano was planning next. Damiano's response was cold. "You could have come to me the moment he approached your father," he said, "instead of waiting until you were $3 million and 18 months deep into his organization. And say what? Beg the man who ended our engagement to save the family. He replaced with a better one?" Victoria's laugh was brittle, humorless. "You weren't exactly approachable after the wedding announcement, Damiano. None of us were sure which version of you we'd get." She told them the rest without further prompting. Castellano wanted Salvatore's seat on the commission, all of it, and he knew the fastest way wasn't a war he'd lose. It was discrediting Damiano publicly, destroying the alliance with the Marlowe family, and making every family believe the Rossi name couldn't be trusted to honor its agreements. "The fire," Elena said. "The video. Fensley's death." Victoria's eyes cut to her, sharper now, admitting Elena was smarter than the wedding photos had given her credit for. There had been no fraud. Not really. Not the kind Elena had found. Castellano had planted those discrepancies months ago, small enough that a careless auditor would miss them, obvious enough that a good one would find them and think she'd uncovered something real. He'd needed her distracted, and that was only the beginning. He had someone inside the organization, Victoria said. Someone close, feeding him schedules and movements and merger timelines for months. The warehouse footage hadn't been leaked by accident. Someone who knew exactly when they'd be there, had sent it to 3 gossip accounts within an hour of the fire starting. She didn't know his name, only that Castellano never told her more than she needed. But it was someone Damiano trusted, someone who'd been in his house, at his table, probably at his wedding. The silence that followed felt suffocating. When Damiano asked why she was telling them this now, after months of serving Castellano's agenda, Victoria's composure finally cracked. He'd told her yesterday that once the Rossi name was sufficiently destroyed, her father's debt would disappear, all $3 million. But the plan needed one more piece, a tragedy significant enough that no one questioned the family's collapse afterward. Her voice dropped to barely a whisper as she said he was planning to hurt Elena, that he thought it was the fastest way to break Damiano completely, the way losing his mother had. Damiano had gone utterly still, the particular stillness Elena now recognized as the moment before he became truly dangerous. Victoria left without waiting for a response, and the sound of the elevator doors closing felt like a door shutting on more than just her exit. He told Elena she wasn't leaving the penthouse without security. Not anywhere. Not until he knew who was feeding Castellano information. Then let me help find them, she said. Not by locking doors, by ending the threat. She was already moving toward the security wing before he could argue, and after a moment, he followed rather than stopped her, which told her more about how far they'd come than any apology could have. There was a room he'd never shown her, unlocked with a code only he knew, monitors and filing cabinets lining the walls, the nerve center of everything he'd spent his life protecting. If someone inside is talking to Castellano, he said, the proof is in here somewhere. Elena went straight for the terminal without waiting for permission, pulling up logs the way she'd once pulled up ledgers. Whoever it was would need consistent access to Damiano's calendar, his merger timeline, and enough proximity to know about the warehouse audit before it happened. She reasoned aloud, narrowing filters as she spoke. That wasn't a wide circle. 4 or 5 people in the entire organization, at most. Damiano read the names over her shoulder as she pulled them up, his jaw tightening with each one. Old loyalties recalculated in real time. He told her to cross-reference against anyone who'd had access to the Whitmore file before he'd authorized the audit. Her fingers moved fast, sorting timestamps against the fire, against the video leak, against the exact hour the threatening text had landed on both their phones. One name appeared in every single window, present at every point where information should have stayed contained, and hadn't. It took her 11 minutes. A message notification blinked on the screen, freshly received, from an internal account neither of them expected to see at all. Priya Chandra. Elena stared at the name, certain for a moment she'd misread it. Damiano moved past her, pulling up the full message thread with a speed suggesting he'd feared this possibility longer than he'd admitted to anyone, maybe even himself. The messages went back 4 months. Priya forwarding schedules, confirming meeting locations, and 3 days before the fire, sending a single line that made Elena's stomach turn to ice. The warehouse audit is scheduled for Tuesday. She'll find the discrepancies. Make sure the records room burns before she gets further than that. She set me up, Elena said quietly. She knew I'd find the numbers, because she's the one who planted them. Damiano's face had carved itself into something harder than stone. She'd worked for this family 6 years, he said, trusted with his schedule, his correspondence, everything he did. She'd known about the merger before Elena did. She'd known about the wedding date before it was announced. She'd had access to it all. They found the reason 20 minutes later, buried in employee records Damiano had never thought to open. Priya's younger brother, still in college, had been arrested 18 months earlier in a trafficking case, with connections tracing directly back to Castellano's organization. Before either of them could respond further, the door opened, and Priya stood in the frame, coffee cup in hand, exactly as she had every morning for 6 years. Her expression shifted the moment she saw the laptop screen. The cup fell and shattered against the floor. Damiano, she started, her voice already breaking. Don't, he said, the single word carrying enough weight that she flinched. Don't say my name like we're still what we were an hour ago. She told them everything at once, that Castellano had her brother, that he'd promised the charges would disappear if she helped him, that he'd sworn nobody would get hurt, and that by the time she understood what he actually wanted, Fensley was already dead, and she was too far in to stop. Damiano reminded her she could have come to him the moment Castellano threatened her, and her voice cracked as she asked whether he would have helped, or whether he'd have decided she was compromised, and cut her out the way he cut out everyone who became inconvenient. She'd watched him build walls for 6 years and call it strength. She hadn't thought he'd make an exception for her. The accusation landed hard, because Elena recognized the shape of it. The same wall that had made him cold with her in the study. The same fear of trust that had cost his mother her life, and now, apparently, had cost Priya her only chance at rescue. She watched Damiano absorb it, watched him decide not to argue, which told her more about how far he'd come in 2 weeks than any apology could have. Once Priya had been escorted from the room to compose herself, Elena told him quietly that Priya wasn't wrong about the walls he built, but that she wasn't blameless either, that both things could be true at once. He admitted he didn't know yet how to be angry at someone, and still owe them a debt at the same time. When Priya returned, calmer, Damiano asked where her brother was now. A halfway house upstate, she told him, under supervision, Castellano's people, checking weekly to make sure she was still cooperating. He wanted the full truth, he said, everything Castellano had asked of her, starting now, and in exchange he'd get her brother free, and the charges gone permanently, not because she'd earned it, but because punishing her further wouldn't undo what had already been done. When she asked why he'd help her after everything she'd done, his eyes flicked briefly to Elena. Someone had recently reminded him that keeping doors locked didn't keep anyone safe. It just kept everyone alone. Over the next hour, Priya laid out everything, and one detail made Elena's blood run cold. Castellano wasn't planning to hurt her through violence, Priya explained. He was going to expose something from an old case of hers, time to destroy both their credibility at once. At the gala this weekend, in front of every family on the commission. She didn't know which case. He'd never told her the name. Elena felt the floor shift beneath her. 4 years of investigations, dozens of clients. Any one of them could be the thread Castellano meant to pull. She told Damiano she needed every file she'd worked before this marriage, tonight, because if she didn't know what he was holding, she couldn't get ahead of it. He didn't target this marriage because of the Whitmore merger, Damiano said slowly, something cold settling behind his eyes. Whatever this is, he's had it waiting for years. Marrying you just gave him a reason to finally use it. So what happens now? Elena asked. If whatever he digs up turns me into a liability, the commission won't forgive. Some of them will admire whatever I did. Others will wonder what else I've hidden. Damiano didn't answer right away, and the silence between them carried a weight neither the fire nor the threats had managed. If the commission decided she was a liability his father couldn't afford, he finally admitted, it wouldn't matter how much either of them wanted to stay married. They'd make it a condition of the alliance. Then we find it before he does, Elena said, and something passed between them. Not resolution, but the recognition that whatever this had become between them was now inseparable from a war neither of them had chosen, but both intended to survive. The gala was 3 days away, and Elena spent the first night going through every case file from before her marriage, spreading 4 years of work across the study floor, while Damiano worked beside her in a silence that felt, for once, like partnership instead of distance. Near 2 in the morning, he pulled a thin folder from a box of records his own contact had quietly gathered on Elena weeks earlier, back when he'd still been deciding whether to trust his own wife. A smuggling case, 4 years old, Jersey ports, 2 men convicted, $11 million seized. He admitted he'd never finished reading the file until now. Elena took it, and the memory surfaced like something dredged from dark water. The operation had belonged to Castellano. She was the reason he'd lost $11 million and 2 of his men to federal prison, 4 years before she'd ever married Damiano. The room went silent, the shape of the conspiracy finally visible, reaching back years further than either of them had imagined. Castellano hadn't targeted this marriage because of the Whitmore merger at all. He'd been waiting for an opening to reach an enemy he'd never forgotten. and marrying into the Rossi family had simply put her close enough to strike. Elena spent every waking hour after that feeling the walls of the penthouse close in tighter. Not from Damiano's overprotectiveness this time, but from the slow understanding that Castellano had been hunting her long before she'd ever heard his name. He wanted to cancel, told her on the second night while pacing the study. My father can handle the commission without us in the room. She reminded him that absence looked like guilt in his world, that he'd told her that himself, and that not showing up meant Castellano won without having to expose anything. And if we go, he humiliates you in front of every family that matters, the same families that already watched a video suggesting you set a fire. You had every reason to expose instead. Then let him try, she said. Let him explain to a room full of powerful men why exposing a smuggling operation makes me dangerous, instead of exactly the kind of person any of them should want on their side. It was Priya, 2 days later, who found the piece that shifted everything, working with the particular urgency of someone trying to earn back a fragment of trust. Castellano wasn't waiting for Saturday, she told them, spreading printouts across the table. He'd already filed a formal appeal motion that morning, on behalf of his 2 men, claiming the original investigation had been compromised. Language that mirrored exactly what he'd told her he'd say at the gala. The gala was just where he'd make it public. Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her. That's not true. I built that case myself, alone, long before Castellano's men ever went to prison over it. It doesn't have to be true, Damiano said grimly. It has to be believable enough to plant doubt. If the commission believes my family orchestrated a federal case against a rival years in advance, it unravels alliances my father spent 30 years building. There was more. The filing listed Victoria's father as a corroborating witness, Priya explained. Castellano, using the debt to force him into testifying that the Rossi family had paid him to falsify records years ago. Damiano decided immediately that word needed to reach the man quietly before the gala, that his debt would disappear, either way now that Castellano's organization was being dismantled from the inside. They found what they needed, at 2 in the morning, an archived timestamp buried in the original federal filing, meaningless to anyone, without Elena's exact expertise. The anonymous tip that had launched her investigation carried a verifiable timestamp, 18 months before she'd even taken the case, submitted by someone under federal witness protection. If they could get the Bureau to confirm the tip's timing without revealing the whistleblower, it would prove the investigation predated her entirely, destroying both his motion and his gala announcement at once. Priya had a contact in the regional office who owed her a favor, someone who couldn't provide documentation but could give verbal confirmation, recorded. The recording came through 6 hours before the gala, a clipped, careful confirmation, carrying enough institutional weight that anyone in that ballroom would recognize its authority. Elena listened 3 times, something solidifying in her chest that had been shaking since Priya's revelation 2 days earlier. Damiano found her afterward on the terrace, city lights spread beneath them like scattered stars. He told her she could have run, the moment she'd learned Castellano was hunting her specifically, but instead, she'd spent 3 days building a case strong enough to save them both. She told him she didn't run, not from bullies at school, not from clients who'd thought a plus-size woman couldn't understand their finances, and not from a man trying to destroy her past to control her future. She wasn't going anywhere, she said, not because of the contract, but because she chose to stay. Something in his expression cracked open, 15 years of careful architecture finally giving way. He admitted he'd been afraid of exactly this, not Castellano, not the commission, her, since the wedding, since she'd asked him why he cared, terrified of how much he'd wanted to answer honestly. Then answer now, she said. I care, he said, because somewhere in the last 2 weeks, without my permission, you became the one person in this world I actually trust. I don't know how to survive losing that, the way I lost her. He reached for her slowly, giving her every chance to step away, and when she didn't, his hand found her face with a gentleness that undid something she'd been guarding since long before this marriage began. The kiss that followed was slow, more confession than passion. 15 years of locked doors finally, quietly, opening. It was his phone, buzzing violently against the railing, that broke them apart. He answered, and Elena watched his face drain of color, the tenderness collapsing into something urgent and afraid. Castellano's people had just taken Priya's brother from the halfway house, 20 minutes ago. If they moved forward with anything at the gala tonight, he wouldn't come back alive. Priya's scream, when she heard the news, was a sound Elena would remember for the rest of her life, raw and unguarded. Damiano was already shifting into the version of himself Elena hadn't seen since the fire, controlled and entirely focused, certain Castellano hadn't moved the boy far. Within the hour, his men had traced the halfway house's security footage to a van registered under another shell company, leading to a warehouse 11 miles from the gala venue, close enough to be convenient, far enough to feel safe. Sending men in loud risked Castellano finding out before they reached the boy, Damiano said, studying a floor plan Priya's contact had pulled from municipal records. They needed something quiet. Elena told him she could get them inside without tripping anything. This warehouse fell under the same shell umbrella as the one that had burned, and if Castellano used the same security contractor for all his properties, the access codes would follow a predictable pattern. She could crack it in 20 minutes. "You're not going in there," Damiano said immediately. "I'm not asking to storm the building," she said. "I'm asking to get your men through the door quietly. That's numbers and patterns. That's what I'm good at." He studied her, protection warring against respect, and for the first time, respect won cleanly. She stayed in the van, as instructed, while the extraction took 11 minutes from the moment his men breached the side entrance she'd unlocked remotely. Priya's brother, terrified but unharmed, was pulled from a storage room. 2 of Castellano's men left zip-tied on the concrete behind him. Castellano didn't know yet his leverage was gone, Damiano said. Returning to the van with a shallow cut above his eyebrow he waved off. When he found out, he'd either flee or come out swinging at the gala, and Damiano needed her ready for either. She told him she was, and meant it more completely than at any point since the wedding. The gala glittered with the particular brutal elegance Elena had come to associate with Damiano's world. Powerful men, and their wives, arranged around a ballroom that could have hosted a coronation. Marco Castellano stood near the center, silver-haired and composed, the picture of a man who believed his plan was still intact. He found them within 20 minutes, his smile sharp enough to cut glass, wondering aloud whether they'd have the courage to show their faces tonight. Damiano matched his tone with cold formality, mentioning he'd heard there was some business planned, something about an announcement. Castellano's smile flickered, the first crack Elena had watched 50 men wear before it shattered completely, as he raised the matter of his wife's rather colorful history with federal law enforcement. "You mean the case where she exposed a smuggling operation that cost you 11 million and 2 of your men," Elena said, loudly enough that the gathering crowd went sharply attentive. "That case." Castellano's jaw tightened as he claimed the evidence had been manufactured, planted by interests eager to eliminate competition, years before this marriage was arranged. The commission head stepped closer, asking whether he had proof of such a serious accusation, and when Castellano admitted only to suspicions strong enough to warrant investigation, Damiano's voice carried deliberately to every corner of the crowd, noting that his wife had come prepared with something considerably stronger than suspicion. Elena played the recorded confirmation, the federal source's careful words confirming the timestamp of the original tip, 18 months before she'd ever touched the case. The ballroom went silent enough that the recording carried to every corner. Once it finished, she told them plainly, that the investigation had begun before she'd ever been assigned to it, before she'd had any connection to the Rossi family, that she'd built the case because she found fraud, the same way she'd found the fraud he'd planted in the Whitmore books, the same way she'd found the fire set to hide it. He hadn't lost $11 million to a conspiracy. He'd lost it because he got caught. The commission head's eyes narrowed on Castellano, recalculating an ally's value in real time. There was more, Damiano said, nodding toward the entrance, where two of his men escorted Priya's brother forward, visibly shaken, but alive, a piece of evidence more damning than any recording. Castellano had kidnapped a member of his staff's family 2 hours ago to coerce their silence tonight. He'd been blackmailing employees, planting evidence in company records, and orchestrating a fire that killed a man named Fensley, all to seize territory he couldn't win through legitimate business. The room went utterly still, Castellano's composure completely collapsing, as he called it fabrication, his voice rising, insisting it was all lies meant to ruin him. The commission head's response was cold, that the federal government didn't fabricate time-stamped whistleblower records for private galas, and that he didn't believe Damiano Rossi had ever needed to kidnap a child to win an argument. Castellano apparently had. His eyes darted for allies already stepping away, the social death reserved for those caught, rather than those who'd simply done wrong. "This isn't over," he said, backing toward the exit. "It is for you," Damiano said quietly. "Every family in this room just watched you kidnap a child and lie to their faces. You won't survive the week, not because I'll come for you, but because they will, the moment they realize what an unstable ally you've become." Castellano left without another word, the doors closing behind him, with a finality that felt, to Elena, like an entire conspiracy collapsing at once. Damiano turned to her, and for the first time since she'd met him, Elena watched every wall he'd built over 15 years simply fall away. He told her quietly that she'd just saved this family, everything his father had built, and she corrected him. They'd saved it. Together. He reached for her hand in front of the entire commission, in front of every family that had once laughed at her wedding photographs, and raised it to his lips with a tenderness that silenced the room more completely than any accusation had. "I love you," he said, quietly enough that it belonged only to her, loud enough that the nearest witnesses heard it anyway. "I've been terrified to say it for 2 weeks, but I'm done being afraid of anything that isn't losing you." The weeks that followed unfolded with a strange, quiet gravity, the kind that comes after a storm finally breaks. Castellano's territory was absorbed within 10 days by rival families, eager to claim what he could no longer defend, his name reduced to a cautionary story. Priya's brother returned to his program under resources Damiano arranged. The charges dissolved. Priya remained on staff, though something had shifted permanently in the trust between them, a debt she spent every day quietly trying to repay. Victoria's father's debt died, along with Castellano's organization. Victoria left the city entirely for a firm in Chicago, and never contacted Damiano again, which Elena suspected was, for both of them, exactly the right ending. The Whitmore merger closed successfully, and Elena's name appeared on the closing documents not as Damiano Rossi's wife, but as the forensic auditor whose work had saved the deal. Fensley's family received a settlement large enough to secure their future, the only apology Damiano seemed to know how to offer, a man he'd failed to protect. It was 3 months after the gala that Damiano found Elena in the study, the same room where he'd first told her about his mother. She looked up as he entered, and something in his expression made her set down the file she'd been reading. "I have something to ask you," he said, nervousness in his voice that didn't belong to the man who'd once silenced an entire commission with a single sentence. "Damiano, we're already married." "On paper," he said, "in a contract neither of us chose, before either of us knew what we'd become to each other." He knelt in front of her, and Elena's breath caught at the sight of a small velvet box, entirely separate from the ring she already wore. "I want to marry you again, properly. Not because our fathers arranged an alliance, but because somewhere in the middle of fires and conspiracies, and a man who tried to destroy us both, I fell in love with the person who refused to run from any of it." Elena felt tears rise, unbidden, the first time she'd cried since the wedding photographs, though these carried none of that old shame. "Yes," she said, before he'd even finished asking. "God, yes." The second wedding took place 2 months later, smaller than the first, curated entirely by Elena's own choices, held at a vineyard upstate, rather than a ballroom built for commission politics. Her cousin, chastened after the fallout from the original photographs, wasn't invited. Instead, the guest list included the people who'd earned their place through the fire and blood of the past months. Priya, her brother now thriving in community college, the federal contact who'd risked her career for a timestamp that saved 2 lives, and Damiano's father, who watched his son marry a woman he'd once selected purely for business advantage, and now clearly adored for reasons that had nothing to do with commerce at all. Elena wore a dress she'd chosen herself, ivory, and fitted exactly to the body she'd stopped apologizing for the night Damiano took a microphone from a stunned wedding band and told 300 people exactly what he thought of anyone who mocked her. When she walked down the aisle, there was no laughter, no comments about her body, no strangers online dissecting her worth. There was only Damiano, watching her with an expression that had nothing guarded left in it at all. She told him he looked terrified when she reached him. He admitted he'd faced armed men with more composure than this, and the small crowd who caught it laughed, warm and easy, nothing like the cruel amusement of the first reception. The vows they exchanged were their own, written without lawyers or family expectations. "I spent 15 years believing that keeping people at a distance was the only way to survive losing them," Damiano said, his eyes never leaving hers. "You taught me love isn't a door you leave unlocked for danger to walk through. It's a door you choose to open anyway. You didn't just save my family's empire. You saved the part of me I thought died in a hallway when I was 12 years old." Elena's vows were quieter, steadier. "I used to think love meant shrinking myself to fit into spaces that weren't built for someone like me," she said. "You never once asked me to shrink. I choose you, Damiano, not because a contract bound us together, but because I found the person I actually want, beside me, for the rest of my life." They kissed, as husband and wife, for the second time, carrying none of the strangeness of strangers, performing a role, only the certainty of 2 people who had earned every ounce of the life they were choosing together. Later that year, Elena left her old firm entirely, opening her own forensic accounting practice with Damiano's quiet, unwavering support, one that specialized in exactly the kind of fraud detection that had once made powerful men underestimate her at their peril. She built a reputation, slowly and entirely on her own merit. As the auditor, no one wanted investigating them, and everyone wanted on their side. On the anniversary of their first wedding, Damiano surprised her with a framed print, not of the photographs that had once caused her so much pain, but of the moment he'd taken that microphone from the band, his face fierce, with a protectiveness neither of them had understood yet as love. Beneath it, engraved, were the words he'd said that night, finally immortalized somewhere she'd see them every day. "She is not a joke. She is my wife." Elena hung it in the front hallway, where every visitor would see it, where the ghost of every stranger who'd once laughed at her body would have to reckon, if only in her own memory, with exactly how thoroughly they'd been wrong. Standing beside her husband years later, watching their daughter chase fireflies across the same vineyard lawn where they'd married a second time, Elena understood something she hadn't known the night those cruel comments first appeared on her phone. The people who mock what they don't understand rarely get to witness what becomes of the person they underestimated. But sometimes, if they're paying attention at all, They get to watch a man they feared above all others stand in front of an entire room and prove that love doesn't make anyone weaker. It simply gives them one more thing worth being strong for.